I think we don't have too many people, so I think this should be fairly easy to do. If you're not speaking, obviously you can mute, but always remember you got to unmute when you're about to speak. I always forget that, and then people are sitting there wondering what in the world is he saying. Anyway, so if you put your little hand up the way you just saw me do that on mine.
You're muted, David.
Yeah, sorry, you can see I can not control all of this myself. So you can put your hand up, but then you have to go up to the little box on the right-hand side in your frame to lower your hand as well. So who'd like to kick it off? Oh, come on.
Well, right. I would start with saying that, Judith, I think you were saying for the discussion part, you were going to put your slide back on with that last slide. And I think that might be helpful in terms of reminding us sort of some of the questions that you had.
I don't know that I actually have that technical capability, Elena.
Oh, okay.
So I'm sorry about that. I had thought that I could have time within the framing of it to do that, but I do have it here. But they're just really questions.
There it just popped up.
Thank you. Whoever did that.
Megan just did that. Thank you.
This is really, I intended them just to be food for thought, because I know mine was pretty high level, and yet I thought it might be helpful before zooming into, well, we'll restore vacant properties, or we'll create an urban wealth fund, or various other kinds of interventions or programs that have been tried, which I hope we will discuss in this session, your examples and what you think, and then also hopefully relate it to larger application than just the specific thing. So I guess that the major questions that I mentioned on that slide were about the role of government in affordable housing delivery, and does that role determine the role of the private sector, whether it be the quote unquote developer, which I think, when you just think about affordable housing development, most people will go to the construction side, although all of you probably know that maybe not the place to go. And then, capital, if we're talking about the investor, whether the developer himself or herself or some other level of investment, there needs to be a safe harbor in order to attract that. What are the incentives, and is there sufficient return on that investment, and how trustworthy is it? And that's one reason why I kind of like to begin often thinking about the situation with the land and the ownership that goes along with that. And then how does the informal, does it fit into the overall delivery system? Are we seeking with private sector engagement to formalize the informal or accommodate it, embrace it in somehow, and how does that happen? There have been lots of examples of things that have been tried, and some have really worked, but to my knowledge anyway, they haven't really reached enormous scale. And then what role, maybe somebody mentioned, and slum upgrading and so forth, is there a role for the formal private sector within that kind of program, or how does it play? Maybe it's through PPP and infrastructure. So these are just kind of random questions that I had to kind of provoke, I hoped, discussion and examples and thoughts from all of you. I don't know all of you, but I know some of you have had lots of really good experience in these areas. So I hope that we will be able to learn from you.
Okay, well, thank you, Judith. Let's go to Larry Hanna. I think I saw his hand to go up first, and then we will come to Steve Giddings after that, and others who want to raise their hand. Go ahead and thanks.
There I go. Good. Well, nice to see all of you, and including the ones I don't know. I think both the water and the housing presentations really had a common theme, and that's about how you need to have a picture of the problem that is comprehensive and includes all the actors and all the factors. And just to illustrate what I mean, why that's so important, think of what's happened about rental housing in the United States during COVID. we've had most, if not all, the states and some federal policies that basically froze the status of tenants and actually invited them not to pay their rent. Hardly any discussion about the people who own these units who are not receiving their rent, and they've all got loans and obligations. And as you all know, a substantial number of the lowest value rental units in the United States are owned by individuals, people who own less than 4 houses or something like that. So I don't think point I'd like to take away from both the presentations is this unified view of all the factors and how they play together is really important. The phrase that was used that corresponds to the table that Judith incorrectly gave me sole credit for. This is work of many people over many years. Just happened to scribble it down that way that day, but I would be remiss to not mention that this is the work of many. The actual terminology we used for this is, as an objective, is the well-functioning housing sector. And that kind of, when you start to think of it, that includes everything we're talking about. And then you can kind of dig down in and think about how those parts work together. The starting point for all that work, and I have to give credit to Steve Mayo and Solly Angel, who's still working on these issues, is you have to start with well thought through definitions and measurement. And I think that's the way Judith started her discussion there. It's amazing when I speak to people, whether in the United States or around the world today, everybody's got a different idea of what affordable housing means. And if that's the case, it's very hard, I think, to get a grip on the more detailed aspects of discussion. Finally, of course, I always have to get this in before I stop speaking on this subject. We know there are 2 things that don't get nearly enough attention when we talk about affordable housing. One thing is the use of the existing stock. That's it does in pretty much every country, that far outnumbers the stock of new units that can be built and made affordable to the occupants. It's existing housing. And the other thing is, and I think the code word for this is California Prop 50, is you got to push the supply side. And that's largely regulations and largely focused on land use, land management questions. So that's my initial cut, but I think both presentations were really good and really reminded us all of the larger picture we need to talk about these things.
Thanks, Larry. Steve, do you want to contribute on this?
Did I unmute there?
You did.
Okay. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay. I think, picking up on the kind of thing that Larry talked about. I mean, it's a whole system where the government and the private sector really have to work together to understand where the deficiencies are in meeting the demand for housing. It certainly can't be solved entirely by the private sector. It certainly, in many cases, where the public sector has tried to take over housing, it's let's say in the former communist countries, the socialist countries, that resulted in kind of disastrous, very low quality housing. That's been pretty much discredited as public housing in the United States. For in the 60s, 70s, and early 80s, we had large public housing programs. Those have largely gone by the board, and we're relying on market forces such as the rental subsidy programs. But it's an understanding of where the public and private can each complement each other. But one of the most fundamental things that I think we really want to talk about is that I wanted to bring up is this whole issue of land access to land for housing, particularly in the context of the tremendous migrations. Well, I won't say it's not all migration, but also the tremendous increase in the urban population in many of these countries, which are stretching the capacity of municipal governments to provide for places to live. When people move from the countryside, many of them, although some of them move to highly dense slums or urban areas, many of them move to peripheral areas because there's no other place for them to go. There's no other land available for them, and these are kind of unserviced areas. And many governments have sort of tried to discourage these sort of sites and services programs that were popular in the 80s and 90s, were sometimes on the peripheries of cities, where land was cheap and available, but what it meant was there's a trade-off here where if you try to locate in a place where land is cheap, you're going to be far from places of employment. Services are going to be lacking, and you're going to be spending more money actually for some of these services than you would if you move to a more dense, more centrally located area. So land availability of land is a real issue, I think, that has yet really to be solved. When you look at the slums of Mumbai or outside, I mean, in fact, that picture that Judith showed, I think of, I don't know where it was, but those high-rise buildings surrounded by this huge, huge area of low-rise buildings, you see how inefficient the slum area is, about how widespread it is, and cities just have not been able to cope with how to improve really or increase the efficiency of some of these slum areas that are close in. So one technique that I ran across once when I was doing some work in South Africa was this whole idea of the government land banking, or providing some incentive somehow to set aside land that it could buy either through purchase or through eminent domain, to hold in reserve so that when private developers can come in, there is land available in reasonably located areas. And I'd be interested if anybody else has any experience with how government can help this whole land situation, which is critical. The other one I wanted to flag, I think, and Judith brought out, is the absolute necessity of secure tenure. People will not invest in housing if there's any sense that they could be thrown out by the government or other means. Whereas if and it doesn't have to be a really formal registered title. It's security, and it means different things in different places. But it's certainly an important concept to keep in mind when we're talking about whether people invest in housing themselves. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Steve. Others who would like to contribute? Alina, I see your hand going up.
Hi, and thanks again for the presentation that you did, Judith. It's always good to see you, and it's nice to feel like we're virtually in the same room. I'm particularly interested in what Steve was talking about in terms of also investment and where the money flow is going now, especially because of the the discussions now about inequality and inequity. And I think that's part of the question that we need to talk about in talking about affordable housing, is these issues of inclusion and inequity that has happened, especially in these larger cities where it's just such a stark contrast. Exactly what Steve was talking about, with the slums being right next door to the very high cat class, very expensive real estate, and then you have the slums right there. That we see that in all of our cities. So I don't know if IHC Global has been working on any of that, or if if USAID has been working on those issues related back to housing.
Am I supposed to answer that?
Yeah,
David?
I was just going to say,
At least in terms of
take that?
IHC Global, yes, we have. I mean, it's certainly an area that is of great interest, and I think that this is a moment for people who are concerned about these issues in light of the pandemic and increasing awareness of the corrosiveness of inequality and the need for systemic change. It seems to me to be a moment for greater advocacy for affordable housing and housing being paid attention to by USAID and others. I mean, so we're sort of active on that front as well. But it seems to me, I mean, and I was trying to also make that case that housing is at the center of people's lives, but it's also at the center of cities' lives, and so therefore economic lives. And somehow what seems so obvious to me, and please everyone help me, does not come across necessarily in a compelling way. And what was so, to me, really pleasing to see Ella's presentation about that had many of the same elements, but looking at it through the lens of WASH. I mean, housing needs WASH. I mean, it's not really adequate housing unless it has that. And I think that part is so often left out. So the argument to me for social inclusion and systemic change, really housing needs to be at the center of that. So all of these things that we're talking about, where the land is and how you engage various actors to accelerate, I think often, and this is an assumption I'm making, but the idea of private sector engaging in this is because of the efficiency argument, the ability to deliver in ways that maybe government isn't so well suited to, and that could perhaps meet the needs of many more people than it does now. And certainly we see in the informal settlements, which gets us back to that whole question of the intersection or the interface between formal and informal. You know, a lot of those informal developers, if you will, are pretty efficient as well. So I really would love to see more work, and we've done some, and looking at how those two sides to the coin can be better aligned with each other to serve overall society.
Thank you, Judith. And are there others who would like to make a comment at this point? Yes, it looks like Tom Solitario, sorry.
Yes. Thanks, David. And I think compared to everybody else here, I am the newbie, and I'm not sure, given that I don't know everyone, but I come from the commercial perspective.
Tom, I'm sorry. I don't know if anybody else is, but I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Hello, hello, hello. Still a problem?
Tom, I don't know if you can turn up your mic at all. If there's any way of doing that, it's just a little bit faint.
I don't know how to up. Oh, let's try this.
That's
Volume.
good. That's better. That's
All right,
better.
let's give it a shot. All right. Well, thank you for allowing me to be part of this discussion, which is very interesting. I come from the sort of the private commercial sector, so maybe the private part, is where I'm looking at this. And while I respect the fact that affordable housing is a challenge, I live in Loudoun County, Virginia, one of the wealthiest counties in America, and we have a ginormous affordable housing problem here as well. So it's not unique, I think, to development. It's a problem globally in all markets, if you will. The key component I want to sort of hammer on the table with my shoe, though, is that from the private perspective, this is about profitability and finance. And so the financial perspective for the private sector is sort of core to the participation in all of this. And I think part of the model that everybody's looking for is what we call is a win-win model, where everybody sort of makes it out. Considerations from the commercial sector, especially on the disincentive side, include the amount of regulation that's involved. Although housing, I mean, it's not a utility like water, but there's an element of that to it. The risk component, in other words, we talked about, somebody mentioned about the pandemic and how landlords aren't getting paid by it. That's a showstopper when it comes to investment in this. And then, of course, the profitability. The nature of how commercial investments are made, of course, depend on a comparison between the cost of money and how it is spent in other areas. So one of the considerations I think here is looking at, in order for a healthy model from a commercial perspective, is what is government good at doing? What is the commercial sector good at doing? And then allowing those or empowering those two bodies to to support the ultimate goal, which is to provide affordable housing. So as I listen to the dialogue today, I respect, what's trying to be done here is to support the poor or the less economically able population to be able to live in a home. And that, I guess that has to come together. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a win-lose, because in a win-lose situation, then you're not going to get anywhere. And the losers can include the private sector as well, and that becomes the disincentive to them to be engaged.
Tom, thank you. I think I can speak for a number of people to say that, yeah, the whole idea is indeed that it has to be a win-win. So it's the question of, how best to do that. I think finance is a real crucial subject, and maybe we can come back to that in a little bit. Luis Rojas, I see, has got his hand up. Why don't you give us your thoughts, Luis?
Can you hear me well? Okay, good. Thank you for the invitation. I'm based in Spain at the moment, but I work for an international consultancy firm, which is based in the UK. So yeah, my specialty is housing. And the comment I wanted to make is related to the way how we, in my opinion, should be thinking about housing, because, and this is tying up to the comment that Tom made just before me. And it's about that it should be seen as a right, housing as a right, as a human right, and not necessarily as something that is going to give a win-win situation for everyone, in the sense that taking it from a developer perspective, because I've worked both with the government organizations and with the private sector as well. And I see that obviously with the private sector, always the intention is to have a profit. I mean, if there isn't a profit, it's not a good project. I mean, the private sector is not going to invest. However, I've seen that projects where the profits are enormous, are huge. I've been involved in projects where billions of pounds are being invested and similarly return many more. So the thing is to have a compromise in which, yes, inviting the private sector to invest in housing, but at the same time considering that the primary principle or goal is that this is a right for people, same as water and sanitation. So there should be that compromise of yes, there might be profits, but that profit cannot be as much. So it cannot be compromising the rights of people to have access to housing. So, and that also comes back to the point of location. I think somebody else, I can't remember who was, two people before me that was speaking about allocation of land for housing. So that's a very good point. Finding land banks from, for example, the government that owns land. But the problem with that, again, is that when the government has that piece of land and has to decide whether to have it for a social housing project or for a commercial project that is going to give more profits, obviously they will go for the latter one, because it's going to give them more profit. So again, it comes back to the point of housing as a right. So not necessarily we have to view the situation as something from an economic point of view, but also as a more human point of view. So that was my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. Appreciate your thought on that. Judith, did you want to react on any of that, or is there anyone here who would also like to speak on perhaps the subject of finance? We touched on it very briefly, but if there are any of you out there who would like to talk about how you get more private engagement in finance, that would be an interesting aspect, I think, to touch on as well. Any takers?
I would love to hear about that, but maybe if I could just make a comment here that I think, Louis, you mentioned something along this, and what Tom was saying, win-win. I agree. This is, who plays what role and what are their incentives, and then what is the societal or economic incentive. And Louis, you touched on something that, I mean, we've been talking, and I will advocate for having this comprehensive framework and being clear about the roles, and then the government, somebody knows how in my dreams anyway, there's a system that works in a very, very lubricated fashion together with the different parts, each doing their role, and the outcomes being housing, because we can't just focus on affordable housing. And I don't know if I actually said that was in one of my slides, and I meant to, because affordable housing is quote unquote a part of the overall market. And so we're talking about how to make that work, but it also has to be understood within an overall housing market and delivery system. But what I really wanted to say here is that we can't all assume that all governments, if you will, or policy frameworks are going to view housing as the same thing, in the sense that some will view it as a good, and others, as you were alluding to, Louis, will view it as a right. And the different kinds of policies flow out from that. And that further, so maybe we don't need any further complications because it's already a very complex subject, but it is something that we should be aware of.
Right. Thank you, Judith. Again, if people would be interested in talking about the finance aspect, I think there are a number of aspects in terms of getting the private sector engaged. Tom pointed out, I think it was Tom, that financing is really key to being able to bring the private sector into housing. And by the way, that applies not just to the formal sector housing developer who is going to go out and get bank financing for his projects, but it also applies to people who are living in existing slum areas who want to do housing improvement or want to reach out and be able to connect to the water or the sewer, but they need $100 or $50 to make the last 100 feet, as we might say. I think I saw Elena's hand go up on this one.
I was actually just saying goodbye to Tom, who had to leave early, but I'm agreeing with you, David. Instead of putting a hands up and a thumbs up, I'm agreeing with what you're saying. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, no, you didn't interrupt me at all. And I don't know, any other thoughts on the finance aspects? I mean, I think that it's one of, like land, it's one of the keys to how we get the private sector engaged, and making finance flow is often a matter of finding ways to reduce the risk for whoever's providing the financing. And I'll stop there. Steve.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a number of things, David, and particularly for the lower income segment where people are living in slums trying to upgrade their housing. I mean, there are a number of places that have tried getting microfinance, which is not specifically necessarily devoted to housing, but can certainly be used for housing. Bringing that into the formula. I think I read somewhere that groups like Habitat for Humanity, I think in Kenya, has come up with some sort of a program where it's a formalized program. I'm not sure whether it's backed by the government or not, or a donor, but it's basically to provide assistance to microfinance institutions that may have been lending in other areas, but are not familiar with the housing sector necessarily. They need a little help in trying to understand what kinds of loans make the most sense. Let me show. Is that that's my phone? Sorry, my phone is somewhere, but it's not here. It'll shut up in a second. But anyway, I'd be interested in kind of successful housing related microfinance to upgrade, as you say, David, the last $50 you need for something to make your house a little more hospitable, or also to expand housing. I mean, we
Right.
and back when we were doing these housing guarantee loan programs back in the 70s and 80s, we would build core houses or something, and then there'd be a small loan to add a room or add a wall or something like that. That has evolved through groups like Grameen and others, but I'd be interested in any other examples that people can think where they're
Yeah,
been
I
successful.
think you're touching on something really very important in terms of reaching informal settlements. I would also say then that, you know, kind of some security of tenure and so forth there, occupancy if not ownership, is probably necessary, although not always. CHF at the time when I was there was doing a lot of work in microfinance for housing, specifically adapted loans. So it wasn't just an enterprise loan, but it was something that was adapted to the cost of a room, for example, was often a way that those loans were structured, is to enable people to improve or expand the existing housing. And what I've always wondered and wanted is, and we did a little bit of work now, and I don't know whether they have continued that or not, working with commercial banks, but if there's a way that government policy and or finance flow that could support this kind of finance and unlock it, and there are a lot of issues with that, informal employment as well as land, but to me that would really unleash a great power with the, you know, the energy of the informal sector as we talk about.
Just a quick note you may have seen pop up. We've got about a minute left. Larry, did you want to comment on, I saw your applause for what Steve was saying, but maybe you wanted to pitch in a little bit on the finance question as well?
Okay. Yeah, let me say a couple of things quickly. The financing story is quite complicated, but you can hear me clearly, can you? I think the question is sometimes, what are we financing? What do we need to finance for? And someone else said earlier in the session, it may have been Judith, that we're short of land. I don't think anybody's short of land. I'm not a fan of that way of describing the problem. What we're short of is permission to build there, zoning, and usually infrastructure. And so to focus on the physical land, it's all there. And densification, of course, within the existing permission is there. And there are cities around the world that have really figured out how to take infill and make it part of their affordable housing strategy. If that works, and because the construction and the building materials side of this market works pretty well, it's very competitive, and there's very little difference in cost of construction of an expensive or cheap house. It's just the price of the land and all that's embedded in that. So I think continuing to focus on how to make the market work more efficiently, pushing down what can be done with everybody winning, and then having intelligent, well-funded, and highly targeted subsidy programs. That's, to me, that's the whole story in a nutshell.
To the main room. Thank you, Larry.
Okay.
Oh, no, I'm